He came to school as always, silent, with a broom in his hand and eyes fixed on the ground. No one ever asked his name. To everyone, he was just the janitor. But that day was different. Inside the classroom, amid the noise of laughter, a teacher jokingly said, "Oh, if you're so smart, then solve this question." The whole room burst into laughter, but he stayed silent. There was no anger on his face, only a strange calm. Moments later, something happened that turned that laughter into silence and revealed a secret no one had ever imagined. This is the story of the man whom everyone looked down on, but who rose above them all. Mark was a quiet man. He arrived at school early in the morning, cleaned the classroom, fixed broken chairs, and disappeared into the noise of the children. To everyone, he was just a simple janitor, but in his eyes, there was a deep world, a world no one had ever tried to understand. Once he used to teach at a university. Yes, the same Mark whom everyone now saw holding a broom was once a lover of mathematics. But an accident and the unfairness of life brought him to a place where knowledge faded away and silence took its place. The school children often laughed at him, some because of his skin color, others because of his job. He just smiled. He knew the world would never take him seriously, but deep inside, a spark was still alive. A spark that would one day show everyone that real worth is not in color, but in mind and courage. That day, when a difficult math problem was written on the board, Mark had just come in to pick up the trash. But he paused for a moment and looked at the question. The same equation, that was once the dream of his life. He didn't know that the next few moments were about to change his entire life. The noise in the classroom was growing louder. The students laughed as they looked at the equation written on the board. "This is impossible," one boy shouted. Miss Helen, the teacher known for her strict and sarcastic nature, looked at Mark with a mocking smile. "Hey, Mark, you clean everything. Let's see, can you clean this board too?" The whole class burst into laughter. Mark's hand stopped holding the broom. For a moment, he stood silently, then slowly walked toward the board, his eyes fixed on the equation. The same formula he had researched years ago. Miss Helen's face carried a taunting smile. "Oh, don't think too much, Mark. People like you aren't made for thinking." Her words struck like lightning. The entire room fell into an uneasy silence, except for a few muffled laughs. Something broke inside Mark, but he hid his feelings. He placed the broom aside, walked up to the board, and picked up a piece of chalk. The students laughed again, but his face remained calm. The kind of calm that comes before a storm. Without saying a word, he drew a line beneath the equation and began writing step by step. At first, everyone thought it was a joke, but moments later, the color drained from Miss Helen's face. Mark's hand moved faster, and with every line, he wrote the very solution she herself had never understood. One boy said in shock, "Miss Helen, it looks completely correct." For the first time, the laughter stopped. Now there was only the sound of chalk, and the hand that was finally speaking after years of silence. Miss Helen shouted angrily, "Stop! How do you know all this?" Mark didn't stop. He finished the final formula, stepped back, and placed the chalk on the desk. The entire class stood frozen. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Miss Helen stepped forward, looked closely at the equation, and whispered, "This is absolutely correct." Mark simply said, "I always knew. No one ever asked me." Outside the door stood the principal, who had witnessed it all. His face showed surprise, and one question, "Who is this man?" A calm smile appeared on Mark's face. But what began that day was not just the solving of an equation. It was the first step against a system that believed color could define intelligence. The room was filled with silence, the kind of silence that comes only when people begin to doubt their own beliefs. Miss Helen stood beneath the formula Mark had written, as if the ground had slipped from under her feet. Her lips trembled. "This is not possible. You're just a janitor." The principal entered the room, his eyes full of both surprise and doubt. "Mark, did you solve this yourself?" Mark simply nodded, but his face carried the dignity that is born after years of silence. Miss Helen tried to hide her frustration. "This can't be his work. Someone must have taught him. Or maybe he copied it from somewhere." A student gathered the courage to speak. "But miss, he was speaking the language of mathematics, one that none of us even understood." Mark said softly, I never came here just to clean. I came to learn. Every day, by watching you all, by listening to how you behave. You only teach lessons, but I've been studying life." The entire room seemed to hold its breath as his words echoed. The principal stepped forward. "Mark, where were you before? You have an extraordinary talent." Mark closed his eyes for a moment and took a deep breath. "I was always here, just unseen, because when people get used to seeing color, they stop seeing the person." No one had an answer. Tears began to fall from Miss Helen's eyes, maybe of shame, maybe of realization. At that moment, the school director entered, called in by the principal. He looked at the board, then at Mark, and said slowly, "This is the same equation our university professors have been working on for years, and it's completely correct." That moment in the classroom still echoed. The equation written on the board, the one everyone had once laughed at, had now become a historic proof that ability cannot be measured by color. Mark's hands were still white with chalk dust. The principal slowly stepped forward and took his hand. "Mark, today you didn't just solve a question. You showed us a mirror." Miss Helen stood silently. Tears flowed from her eyes. For the first time, she understood how deeply her sarcasm could wound someone. She said to Mark, "I owe you an apology. You taught me a lesson that I could never teach in my entire life." A few days later, a new plaque was placed on the school wall. Mark Williams, the man who solved more than a math problem. He was no longer just a janitor. He had become a hero, a lesson for the students of that school. But for Mark, this victory was not personal. He often said, "What I proved wasn't just for me, it was for every person who has ever been judged for their skin, their language, or their clothes." In a TV interview, when a reporter asked, "Mark, have you forgotten the way people treated you?" he smiled and said, "No, I don't want to forget, because remembering is the first step toward change." His words still echo in classrooms where someone is looked down upon, on faces that stay silent, and in hearts fighting to prove their worth. This story isn't just Mark's. It's the story of every person who turned their talent into a weapon against prejudice, of every human who defeated hate with patience. In the end, Mark sat in the school courtyard. Children gathered around him, asking questions, and he answered each one with a smile. There was peace in his smile, but in his eyes, one question still lived. How many Marks are still hidden behind a broom somewhere, only because we refuse to see them? This story is not an ending. It is a reminder. Greatness has always been greater than color.